Today's extract is from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. This is the fourth in the Harry Potter series, and it is time for the 700-year-old Triwizard Tournament to begin, a series of 3 potentially deadly challenges for which the winner will win the coveted Triwizard's Cup, 1,000 galleons, and eternal glory. Much mystery surrounds how Harry Potter, a wizard who should be too young to compete, has managed to be selected to represent Hogwarts alongside the incredibly popular Cedric Diggory. This reading is from Chapter 1, and here we learn the misfortunes of the Riddle family, a surname, if you have read the earlier books in the series, that should be familiar to you. Here are your 3 comprehension questions. 1. What is the current state of the Riddle House as described in the text? Number 2. What strange event occurred at the Riddle House 50 years before the events of the story? And number 3. What did the villagers think of Frank Bryce after his release? As a discussion point, I would like you to think, how important is it that we don't immediately jump to conclusions? Chapter 1. The Riddle House. The villagers of Little Hangleton still called it the Riddle House, even though it had been many years since the Riddle family had lived there. It stood on a hill overlooking the village, some of its windows boarded, tiles missing from its roof, ivy spreading unchecked over its face. Once a fine-looking manor and easily the largest and grandest building for miles around, the Riddle House was now damp, derelict, and unoccupied. The Little Hangletons all agreed that the old house was creepy. Half a century ago, something strange and horrible had happened there, something that the older inhabitants of the village still liked to discuss when topics for gossip were scarce. The story had been picked over so many times and had been embroidered in so many places that nobody was quite sure what the truth was anymore. Every version of the tale, however, started in the same place. 50 years before, at daybreak, on a fine summer's morning when the Riddle House had been well kept and impressive, a maid had entered the drawing room to find all 3 riddles dead. The maid had run screaming down the hill into the village and roused as many people as she could. "Lying there with their eyes open, cold as ice, stealing their dinner things." The police were summoned, and the whole of Little Hangleton had seethed with shocked curiosity and ill-disguised excitement. Nobody wasted their breath pretending to feel very sad about the riddles, for they had been most unpopular. Elderly Mr. and Mrs. Riddle had been the rich, snobbish, and rude kind, and their grown-up son Tom had been, if anything, worse. All the villagers cared about was the identity of their murderer, for plainly 3 apparently healthy people did not drop dead of natural causes all on the same night. The Hanged Man, the village pub, did a roaring trade that night. The whole village seemed to have turned out to discuss the murders. They were rewarded for leaving their firesides when the riddle's cook arrived dramatically in their midst and announced to the suddenly silent pub that a man called Frank Bryce had just been arrested. "Frank?" cried several people. "Never!" Frank Bryce was the riddle's gardener. He lived alone in a run-down cottage on the grounds of the Riddle House. Frank had come back from the war with a very stiff leg and a great dislike of crowds, loud noises, and had been working for the riddles ever since. There was a rush to buy the cook drinks and hear more details. "Always thought he was odd," she told the eagerly listening villagers after her 4th sherry. "Unfriendly like. I'm sure if I'd offered him a cuppa once, I've offered it 100 times. Never wanted to mix, he didn't." "Ah, now," said a woman at the bar. "He had a hard war, Frank. He likes a quiet life. That's no reason to—" "Who else had a key to the back door, then?" barked the cook. "There's been a spare key hanging in the gardener's cottage back far as I can remember. Nobody forced the door last night. No broken windows. All Frank had to do was creep up to the big house while he was all sleeping." The villagers exchanged dark looks. "Always thought he had a nasty look about him, right enough," grunted a man at the bar. "War termed him funny, if you ask me," said the landlord. "Told you I wouldn't like to get on the wrong side of Frank, didn't I, Dot?" said an excited woman over in the corner. "Horrible temper," said Dot, nodding fervently. "I remember when he was a kid." By the following morning, hardly anyone in Little Hangleton doubted that Frank Bryce had killed the Riddles, but in the neighbouring town of Great Hangleton, in the dark and dingy police station, Frank was suddenly repeating again and again that he was innocent, and that the only person he had seen near the house on the day of the Riddle's death had been a teenage boy, a stranger, dark-haired and pale. Nobody else in the village had seen any such boy, and the police were quite sure that Frank had invented him. Then, just when things were looking very serious for Frank, the report on the Riddle's body came back and changed everything. The police had never read an odder report. A team of doctors had examined the bodies and had concluded that none of the Riddles had been poisoned, stabbed, shot, strangled, suffocated, or, as far as they could tell, harmed at all. In fact, the report continued in a tone of unmistakable bewilderment, the riddles appeared to be in perfect health, apart from the fact they were all dead. The doctors did note, as though determined to find something wrong with the bodies, that each of the riddles had a look of terror upon his or her face, but as frustrated as the police said, whoever heard of 3 people being frightened to death? As there was no proof the riddles had been murdered at all, the police were forced to let Frank go. The riddles were buried in the little Hangleton churchyard, and their graves remained objects of curiosity for a while. To everyone's surprise, and amid a cloud of suspicion, Frank Bryce returned to his cottage on the grounds of the Riddle House. "As far as I'm concerned, he killed them. I don't care what the police say," said Dottin the hangman, "and if he had any decency he'd leave here knowing as how we knows he did it." But Frank did not leave. He stayed to tend the garden for the next family who lived in the Riddle House, and then the next family, for neither family stayed long. Perhaps it was partly because of Frank that the new owner said there was a nasty feeling about the place, which in the absence of inhabitants started to fall into disrepair. Here are the answers to your 3 questions. Number 1. The Riddle House is described as damp, derelict, and unoccupied. Some of its windows are boarded up, tiles are missing from its roof, and ivy is spreading unchecked over its face. Number 2. 50 years before the events of the story, at daybreak on a fine summer's morning, all 3 members of the Riddle family were found dead in the Riddle House. The maid discovered their lifeless bodies in the drawing room. The event was mysterious and led to a great deal of gossip and speculation among the villagers. And number 3. After Frank Bryce was released due to lack of evidence, the villagers still suspected him of the murders. They believed that he was guilty, and many of them thought he should leave the village, expressing their distrust and hostility towards him. If there are any books that you would like to recommend for a Drop Everything and Listen session, please don't hesitate to let me know.